Welcome to Hashtag History. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Leah. And if you are a history nerd,
or even if you are a history hater,
this is the podcast for you.
Even if history was your least favorite subject in school, we can guarantee you will like this podcast because we talk about all the things that your history textbooks did not.
That's things like how Ted Kennedy drove his car off a bridge and was able to escape the car but left a woman inside to die and didn't report it until a day later.
Or how the pharaoh Akhenaten was so disliked by Egyptians that they literally purged his name from nearly all of their records and pretended like he never existed.
Or how the FBI had a file on Frank Sinatra that was 2,000 pages long.
Or even how on opening day at Disneyland, it was so hot and the pavement had been so recently poured that women's heels sunk into it.
And we do all of this while drinking a custom-made cocktail specific to that week's episode.
So grab a drink, take a seat, and hang out with us each week as we learn all about history's greatest stories of controversy,
conspiracy,
and corruption. Hashtag History can be found on all major podcast platforms, and that's hashtag spelled out, hashtag history.
We can also be found on Instagram at hashtag history_podcast.
Do you want to know what it's like to hang out with MS-13 in El Salvador? How the Russian mafia fought battles all over Brooklyn in the 1990s?
Or what about that time I got lost in the Burmese jungle hunting the world's biggest meth lab? Or why the Japanese Yakuza have all those crazy dragon tattoos? I'm Sean Williams.
And I'm Danny Gold. And we're the hosts of the Underworld Podcast. We're journalists that have traveled all over, reporting on dangerous people and places. And every week, we'll be bringing you a new story about organized crime from all over the world.
We know this stuff because we've been there, we've seen it, and we've got the near misses and embarrassing tales to go with it. We'll mix in reporting with our own experiences in the field, and we'll throw in some bad jokes while we're at it.
The Underworld Podcast explores the criminal underworlds that affect all of our lives, whether we know it or not. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we continue our investigation into the death of JonBenét Ramsey. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the JonBenét Ramsey Show. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my exceptional co-host, Alice.
Aw, hi, Brett. It's so good to hear
Hi,
your
Alice.
voice.
It's good to hear your voice,
We have
too.
both been just running in crazy directions all over, seemingly the country, working
Yes.
and getting sick at the same time. So it's just good to sit down and talk to you finally.
I know. We haven't recorded an episode in a while because we've been so out of sorts, but we're back. We're back as we continue to work on the JonBenét Ramsey case. You know, Alice, we've been recording this so long that episodes have actually started to come out, which is a little unusual for us. Usually we have finished the series before the episodes come out, but now we're getting that initial feedbacks, which is kind of interesting, even as we're recording.
It's also kind of there's a lot of pressure because people will leave comments like, I'm sure they're going to go into this minor detail in an entire episode, future episode. I'm like, ooh, are we going to?
And I'm like, did we mention that? Did we mention that at all? I don't know.
I'm not really sure that's an entire episode worth. Whoops.
Yeah.
Sorry
yeah.
to disappoint.
I know. But I do have one thing I want to say to all of you, and there were so many more of you than I thought that got the riddle. It does not mean you're a psychopath. It just means you're an evidence-based thinker. I would like to think that because you listen to our podcast, you were better situated to get the answer to that riddle right. And I just got to say, tons of you got it, which is really unusual because I've been telling people that riddle for a long time, and almost nobody gets it, but a lot of you guys got it. So I'm really proud of all of you.
Yeah, it was a little bit shocking because I didn't get it right the first time you told me the riddle, and so the fact that so many of you got it, I would just like to think that you have graduated from the Prosecutor's Podcast School of Law, and you succeed now.
There you go. You're eligible to be barred in at least one state now. So
on this
congratulations. Yeah, and so, before we get into our topic for today, there were a couple things I wanted to address because people have mentioned them, and I think they're worth addressing. One of them is something we talked about earlier on, but really didn't spend a whole lot of time on, is the fact that the Ramseys, they hired these lawyers, they hired these private investigators, they hired these media folks, and, there were some people who thought we didn't spend enough time on that because that was something that really made them feel like the Ramseys were guilty. It was something that really pushed them in that direction. And I just wanted to address that briefly because I'm not sure it tells you much of anything. And this is the reason why. If the Ramseys are guilty, then, they hired these PIs to find evidence pointing towards an intruder and maybe to keep tabs on what the police knew. They would have hired these media consultants to present the Ramsey story and convince the public that an intruder did this and that the Ramseys are innocent. If they were guilty, they would have hired these lawyers to protect the Ramseys from prosecution and press the DA to pursue possible intruders. I think those are all the reasons that people who think the Ramseys are guilty think that they did this, that they hired all these folks. But what I would ask you to consider is, what if they're innocent? What if the Ramseys are innocent? Would the Ramseys, with all of their wealth, have done anything different? Because I would present to you that if the Ramseys were innocent, they would have hired these PIs to find evidence pointing towards an intruder, keep tabs on what the police are doing. They would have hired media consultants to present the Ramsey story, convince the public that an intruder did this and that they were innocent, and they would have hired lawyers to protect them from prosecution and push the DA to pursue possible intruders. And the reason I say it that way is because if you have some sort of behavior, and we talk about this behavior stuff all the time, if you have this behavior that you're looking at and you're trying to figure out, does this point towards guilt or not? Just imagine, would the behavior have been any different if they were innocent or if they were guilty? And I think in the case of the Ramseys, the answer is no. I don't think what they did would have been any different. And put yourself in their shoes. If you had their money and resources, what would you do with it? You would spend as much as you needed to spend on whatever resources you needed to find who killed your daughter. And I think you would do that whether you were guilty or innocent. So that's one reason that I just don't think that the fact that they hired a bunch of people really says anything about whether they did this or not.
I think it's just very fraught, especially with people who have the means to hire attorneys. Attorneys are expensive. They charge by the hour. Very rarely will you get a flat rate attorney for something that's ongoing, active investigation sort of thing. A lot of people reach out to attorneys for crisis management in addition to representation. And I honestly think oftentimes, Brett, when we have defendants who have means to hire attorneys, they end up hiring the most expensive, flashy attorneys who actually don't give them the best advice. They kind of get them twisted up into knots, into pretzels, and kind of makes things more difficult for the defendant because guess what? If it's more complicated, they get more money. And so it's hard to say once you hire that attorney, so much of it is just based on the attorney's advice of how you act. And it's hard to know what would be how the Ramseys would have acted on their own volition versus the type of advice they're getting, whether it's good or bad.
And the other thing some people brought up that I wanted to address, because people think this a lot, and I almost hate to disabuse you of this notion because it probably makes our jobs more difficult. But there's this notion that if you don't talk to the police or you don't do exactly what the police want or you don't show up when the police want you to be there, that you're obstructing justice, that you could be arrested for interfering with an investigation. I think this comes from television or something. And so some people wondered, why the Ramseys weren't charged with obstructing an investigation because they took so long to talk to the police? And the answer is because they don't have to talk to the police. You have a constitutional right that you don't have to talk to the police. You don't have to say anything that would incriminate yourself. They were in a very good position where the police wanted to talk to them, and they were able to sort of leverage that into learning more about the investigation and more about what was going on. And people have criticized them for that, and I'm not going to say that's not worthy criticism. I don't know how I would handle it or not, but number one, it's not a crime what they did, certainly, and I don't know how much it tells you about their potential guilt. The only other thing I wanted to address before we got into what we're going to talk about today is people have pointed to, and it's funny, all we're talking about today is behavior so far, because behavior, people focus on it so much, and it makes sense because the average person, when you're watching this, you're looking at it, the direct evidence you can see is how people are behaving, right? I mean, you don't have the literature in front of you. You know, you're not a doctor, but you are a human being, and so you can judge people based on how they act because you do that every day. It's something we all do every day when we're interacting with people. And so one of the things people talk about is the behavior of the Ramseys and of Burke in the interviews they gave, and people think they came off as wooden or unusual, or they smiled too much, or they laughed too much, or they were too emotional, or they were not emotional enough. And I just wanted to say one thing about that. I've worked in communications in addition to working in the law, and I've had the opportunity to prepare people for very important media appearances, and in some cases where they were not used to doing that, giving interviews that were really important when they weren't used to giving interviews. And it is difficult to overstate how hard it is for the average person to appear on television and not appear unusual, weird, stiff, nervous, because they're all of those things, because they're not used to it. And I think you see that a lot in the interviews you see, particularly with Burke. I mean, I just think these folks were not used to this kind of media scrutiny, and so sometimes they come off in a way that may strike you as strange, but I don't know that honestly is that different from how the average person would react to that kind of interview situation.
You know, whenever I prepare anyone for some sort of public speaking event, whether it's before a small crowd, large crowd, in front of media, the scene of Anchorman where he says, "What do I do with my hands?" is what always flashes across my mind, no matter how polished the person is that I'm helping to prepare. Because sometimes we prepare our bosses to give press conferences, those sorts of things. And even the most polished people, at some point while I'm prepping them, I'm like, just act normal. don't be so
And they're like,
stilted.
what does that mean?
And they're like, what is normal? I always put my hands on my head. And you're like, no, just be normal. And these are people who have experience even. They just stress makes us act weird, and stress can be triggered by a host of things, not just by guilt.
Alice, before we continue, I want to talk about one of our favorite sponsors, Surfshark. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Surfshark. You know, Alice, I was watching the Olympics, and I really love the biathlon. But when I went to watch it on demand, it wasn't available in my area. Fortunately, I had a VPN, and I was able to view it by putting myself smack down in jolly old England. And I know a lot of you have seen this video is not available in your location, and it drives you crazy. And if it does, let me tell you why a VPN is the solution to your problem. A VPN doesn't only increase online privacy, which you need, trust me, and helps you avoid hackers. It also helps you access entertainment because the content you see is limited by your geographic location.
But if you use a VPN, you can change your virtual location and forget about restrictions and censorship. Can't find what to watch on Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, or some other streaming platforms? Unlock new libraries with a VPN. Can't watch a YouTube video? Connect to a different location with a VPN. Can't access certain websites or apps through school or office networks? Try a VPN. So try Surfshark risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Get Surfshark VPN at surfshark.deals/prosecute. Enter promo code prosecute for 83% off and 3 extra months free. You heard me right. 3 extra months for free. That's surfshark.deals/prosecute. Brett, before we move on, the Prosecutors Podcast is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you get a great rate on car insurance, even if it's not with them. They have this nifty comparison tool that puts rates side by side so you choose a rate and coverages that work for you. So let's say you're interested in lowering your rate on your car insurance. Visit progressive.com to get a quote with all the coverages you want. You'll see Progressive's rate, and then their tool will provide options from other companies, all lined up and easy to compare, so that all you have to do is choose the rate and coverages you like. Progressive gives you options so you can make the best choice for you.
You could be looking forward to saving money in the very near future. More money for, say, a pair of noise-canceling headphones, an Instapot, more puzzles, whatever brings you joy. Get a quote today at Progressive.com. It's one small step you can do today that can make a big impact on your budget tomorrow. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Welcome to Hashtag History. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Leah, and if you are a history nerd,
Or even if you are a history hater,
this is the podcast for you.
even if history was your least favorite subject in school, we can guarantee you will like this podcast because we talk about all the things that your history textbooks did not.
That's things like how Ted Kennedy drove his car off a bridge and was able to escape the car but left a woman inside to die and didn't report it until a day later.
Or how the pharaoh Akhenaten was so disliked by Egyptians that they literally purged his name from nearly all of their records and pretended like he never existed.
Or how the FBI had a file on Frank Sinatra that was 2,000 pages long.
Or even how on opening day at Disneyland, it was so hot and the pavement had been so recently poured that women's heels sunk into it.
And we do all of this while drinking a custom-made cocktail specific to that week's episode.
So grab a drink, take a seat, and hang out with us each week as we learn all about history's greatest stories of controversy,
Conspiracy,
and corruption. Hashtag History can be found on all major podcast platforms, and that's hashtag spelled out, hashtag history.
We can also be found on Instagram at #history_podcast.
And I think if you can anchor as much of your sort of behavioral analysis in the evidence as you can, I think that's a more valuable way to do it. I mean, just think of Scott Peterson. So a lot of people watched Scott Peterson's interview and they thought he acted strange and that pointed to the fact he was guilty. And you may recall, we didn't even spend that much time on his interview because it just wasn't that important to us. The behavioral things he did that we thought were interesting were driving out to the marina and staring out over the water where Lacey's body would eventually be found, or even buying all the porn channels while she was still missing, which seemed like an unusual thing to do, or leaving the voicemail talking about where he'd been when he'd never told her that he was going fishing, but not mentioning the fact that she had no idea he was in Berkeley. Those kind of things, I think, are a little bit stronger behavioral items than just this person gave an interview and they looked funny and they acted strange. I mean, to me, how much of that is nerves versus guilt, I think is really hard to tell in the abstract. But enough on that. We'll do more reaction to JonBenét Ramsey as we go along, but we did just want to address a few things. Since so many of you are reaching out with comments, you can see that we actually are reading them. We really do listen. So, we've been talking a lot about the evidence against the Ramseys. Today, we're going to talk a lot about evidence of an intruder. And we've said this a lot of times, that crimes are messy and that typically when you have an intruder, there's going to be evidence of that intruder's existent. You may remember with Darlie Routier, one thing that gave us a lot of pause in that case was the fact that it just didn't seem like there was any evidence of an intruder. And you had this brutal murder where 2 children were stabbed to death, and she supposedly had these defensive wounds. And where's the evidence that there was a person there inflicting those? And that was one of the things that points to her guilt. And then you look at this case and you want to think, is there evidence in this case of an intruder? Is there evidence that someone came in through that window or came in through some other way? And if that evidence exists, what is it? As we said before, it's very difficult for anyone to be present in a place and leave no trace. Do we have any of that evidence here? And the truth of the matter is, the evidence of an intruder is sparse, approaching non-existent. Now, there are a few things that we'll point to. There's an unsourced palm print on the wine cellar door that has never been identified. I say that with a caveat I'll get to in a second. Is this the intruder? It's possible, but as we've said before, there are fingerprints all over people's homes. There's fingerprints all over your homes. There's palm prints all over your home. A lot of those are going to be unsourced. You're not going to know who they are. If there's ever a crime, the police are going to wonder who they are. And if this person left that palm print, this was one of the things we talked about in Darlie Routier. You know, you say, well, there's a fingerprint and it's unsourced. Why is there only one? You know, why is there just this palm print? This person who committed this crime managed to not leave any other fingerprints anywhere, but they left their palm print on the door. You can't rule it out, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's more likely this is a random worker or a visitor to the home. I said that caveat earlier, and in fact, there has been a report in the Rocky Mountain News back in 2002 that the palm print was that of Melinda Ramsey, who is JonBenét's half-sister. Now, I tried to nail that down and be able to say definitively that that was true. I wasn't able to do that, but it really would not surprise me if that is the source of the palm print.
Yeah, I mean, usually when you have a glove on, it would be strange to kind of peel your glove up so that it would expose the palm, but still cover the rest of your, fingertips, where the fingertips don't leave any markings anywhere. So I agree with you. It sounds more just like it was left behind from some other person. There was a high-tech boot print near the body that appeared to be fresh. No one in the family was ever shown to own a pair of high-tech boots, but these boots were popular with police officers. Ordinarily, the police would simply exclude the footwear of the officers in the area. But in this case, the control over the scene, as we've said over and over, was so poor that the Boulder Police Department was never able to establish which officers were in the storage room to be able to rule out their footprints. One officer even hired an attorney when asked to turn over his footwear and give a statement as to whether he'd been inside the house that day. By the way, it is not a popular theory, and there's no real allegation, at least at this time when they're first looking at the crime scene, that the cops had anything to do with this murder. And yet this officer hires an attorney, back to our discussion earlier as to why would the Ramseys hire an attorney if they're not guilty. People get scared when they're told to turn over things about themselves, like a statement, like a shoe or a shoe print, something like that. So just keep that in mind when you think about, is this officer really part of some vast child sex crime cover-up? I don't think so, but even he hired an attorney, which it's not inexpensive.
It is unusual for the police to be this difficult, but I think this is a situation where there were a lot of officers who were doing a lot of things, probably in a lot of places they shouldn't have been in, and didn't follow procedure, and they were worried about getting in trouble. So like Alice said, nobody thinks this guy killed anybody, but he's hiring an attorney nonetheless. There are people who will say that it's possible that Burke Ramsey owned a pair of high-tech boots. I would just say, if the Boulder police are not capable of excluding the footwear of a 9-year-old, then they really do have problems. If this boot print belonged to Burke Ramsey, we would all know it. It's clearly not his. It almost certainly is a police officer's. There have been suspects in this case who owned high-tech boots, including one suspect who killed himself shortly after this crime was committed. And so it's sort of a popular thing that people look at. But if I had to guess, I would say this is a police officer's shoe print.
Yeah, to be honest, I put this in the category of the pineapple in the milk on the counter, where it seems like it should be huge. But when you really think about the mismanagement of the crime scene, this likely was a police officer's footprint. There was a scuff mark below the open window that could have come from the intruder as they lifted themselves back through the window. Once again, this is certainly possible, but it's hard to say where it might have come from. It could have also just been a scuff mark on a basement wall. I have scuff marks all over my house because I have young children, but certainly in areas of the house where you're constantly moving things, like the basement, which is often used for storage, for, like the train toys, for Christmas presents. I can imagine the movement of so many things often can cause scuff marks. So it's, we know everything for you, but I don't know that we can definitively say this scuff mark had anything to do with an intruder.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe it was Fleet White made it when he was moving the suitcase. So we talked about some fiber evidence last time, fibers that were present on JonBenét and on the duct tape that was on her mouth that were matched to some things that Patsy had. There were also some fibers found on the body that did not match anything in the house, and these appeared to be from a beaver. Now, the police were never able to source this to any clothes in the home. There are plenty of people who believe that any such clothing could have been removed by the Ramseys during the multiple opportunities that family members were given to take clothes and other items out of the house. If you've read Thomas's book, Thomas talks about this incident where I believe it was Patsy's sister went back into the house to get some things and ended up leaving with like a trunk full of stuff. And it really bothered him for obvious reasons. I think there's a perfectly innocent explanation for it if it were innocent. The Ramseys were never going back into that home, and this was an opportunity to get a bunch of stuff. But it is a problem when you're trying to have an investigation, and you want a controlled scene, and you want to do things like compare the fibers from the beaver to all the clothes. Beaver seems like something you could imagine Patsy Ramsey having. I don't know how many intruders are running around with beaver fur, but who knows? Maybe beaver fur is a really popular type of fur in clothing. If you're into fur and you know about the use of beaver, please let us know. I'd be interested to know that. But you never know. This is a fiber we haven't been able to match, so maybe it's a sign of an intruder. There were also some dark animal hairs, possibly from a dog, that were on JonBenét's hands. But once again, who knows? She's a little girl. Maybe she was petting dogs. Hard to say.
This is so interesting because when people focus on the Ramseys being able to remove clothing in all their opportunities to come in order to avoid being detected as beaver fibers, I have to note, they didn't know about these fibers until much later, right? You have to go analyze the fibers, so it's not like they knew exactly what fibers were there. Now you think, okay, well, the killer, let's say if it's the family, they know what clothes they were wearing or what clothes touched JonBenét at the time of the murder, so remove all those clothes. Here's the problem. These are also a lot of the same people who say, aha, Patsy Ramsey's wearing the same clothes as last night. Whether she put them back on or she never took off her clothes, that indicates she killed her. The first piece of clothing I would remove is probably what I was wearing if I was the one covering up or killing someone. That's really difficult because you would think, first of all, I don't know where the beaver fibers came from. I did a quick search, are clothes made from beaver? And apparently beaver pelts were used to make cloth back in the 1850s in London for like coats and hats. So maybe, but it does not seem like a common clothing garment, common clothing material to be used for any sort of garments. But I just note that don't just focus on the fact that they could have removed clothing, but rather the fact that JonBenét is in her own clothes, right? Those clothes haven't been removed. You could easily remove the clothes she was wearing because then you'd remove fibers. She's covered up with her blanket. And there are clothes that Patsy Ramsey was wearing the night before that she still has. And so, just keep this in mind because I think the fibers, we talked about fiber analysis being helpful in certain circumstances, but here it causes a lot of confusion. It might just be that they were in a lot of places the day before, Christmas parties, dropping off presents, having Christmas, lots of guests, that she picked up fibers many places that are just foreign to her own house.
And I just want to go back to something you pointed out, because one of the interesting things about this case and the evidence that people point to for intruders or not intruders is how contradictory so much of it is, and how much, at first glance, it may point in a certain direction, but when you look at it more deeply, it seems to actually cut in the other direction. And so let's talk about those clothes that Patsy was wearing. As you just pointed out, if you believe that the fact she was wearing the same clothes she was wearing the night before points to her guilt, then these beaver fibers do not come from her. We know what she was wearing, and it doesn't have beaver, right? So what you need to be true is that she wasn't wearing those clothes that night. She was wearing some other clothes that included beaver, and that she got rid of those clothes, because like you said, the first thing you do is get rid of the clothes you were wearing, and then maybe put back on the same clothes. But if that's true, then the fact that she's wearing the same clothes, it's not because, as Thomas thinks, that she never took them off and she was busy murdering JonBenét all night. It's just sort of a random coincidence that doesn't really mean much of anything. So it is interesting how the push and pull of evidence in this case, and how it seems to turn things on its head, even when you think you finally have an aha moment and something you can point to as a concrete piece of evidence, then the other evidence seems to undermine that. So there were also some fibers found in JonBenét's bed that were consistent with the fibers from the rope binding her hand. Although the rope could have come from inside the home, it's never been sourced, and it's hard to understand why the family would bind JBR in the bedroom, no matter what the circumstances of her death might be. So if you believe this is an accident, for instance, where Patsy accidentally kills JonBenét in the bathroom, even if you were going to stage this crime, you wouldn't tie her up in the bedroom. You would do that all downstairs, just like the fact that the grate comes from the paint set right outside the wine cellar. That's where you would be doing this. You wouldn't be doing it in her bed. Now, the thing I'll say about this is, if it's an intruder, unless you believe the stun gun theory, I think it's hard to believe that JonBenét was forcibly removed from that bedroom because nobody heard it. If an intruder got her out of her bedroom, they had to have done it silently. And you would think if they were tying her up in there, she would need to be knocked out one way or the other if they were going to do that, or she would have made noise and somebody would have heard her. Speaking of noise, one thing we talked about when we talked about the timeline is this scream that one of the neighbors heard. And this seems like a pretty significant thing. If JonBenét is screaming, then wouldn't the parents have heard that? Wouldn't Burke have heard that? There are a couple problems with that. Number one, this basement is far removed from where the family would have been. This is a big house, a bigger house than any of us have probably ever lived in. The parents were on the third floor. Burke was on the second floor. There was then a first floor. Then there was the basement. They've done tests, and you could not hear a scream in the basement because of some grates that I think were used for laundry, like laundry room vents. You actually could hear a scream outside that you would not hear inside, which is sort of an interesting auditory phenomenon that might seem strange to you. The other thing is the neighbor, after saying she heard a scream, later clarified that it was possible that it was just the psychic emanation of JonBenét's pain and not actually a scream that she heard. So you can take that piece of evidence for what it's worth.
What? I mean, if she were my witness and I was like, yes, we have a scream, and then she's like, or a psychic emanation, I'd be like, what? Okay, we're not calling you as a witness.
Yeah, there's so much of that.
And I say, let me expound upon that. Not because I think that's a silly notion of a psychic emanation. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know enough about that. But what's frustrating is she would have no idea to think or has such a connection with this child that even if the child were silently screaming, she would have heard next door in her own mind. Right? That seems to be post hoc reasoning of, this poor child has gone through something. My heart goes out to them. But you wouldn't have known at 2 a.m. or whatnot the night before to know that. Now, if she were like a mother saying, I'm somehow, emotionally tied to my child, and I woke up in the middle of the night at the exact time the child was taken to the hospital, maybe. But this neighbor would have no reason to have this like emotional psychic tie to JonBenét.
That was very diplomatic of you.
Well, I didn't want to just completely dismiss it. I wanted to give our listeners an explanation of why I guffawed at it.
Yes. And, I mean, that's just not great evidence in a courtroom.
No.
Either way,
No.
whatever you think about psychic emanations, and those aren't the exact words she used, but they're very close to that.
Before we move on, Brett, I am so excited because we've got a very different kind of sponsor for this episode, the Jordan Harbinger Show, which is a podcast you all really should be listening to. And I know that every day somebody tells you that you just have to listen to some podcast, and you nod and say, sure, and then you never listen to it. But don't let that happen here. Jordan's show, which Apple named one of its best of 2018, is aimed at making you a better informed, more critical thinker so you can get a sense of how the world actually works and come to your own conclusions about what's happening, even inside your own brain. Each episode is a conversation with a different, fascinating guest. And when I say there's something for everyone here, I really mean it. In one episode, Jordan talks to a hostage negotiator from the FBI who offers techniques on how to get people to like and trust you, which sounds useful and disturbing at the same time.
Yeah, Alice, and let me just say, I think if you like our podcast, you're going to like the Jordan Harbinger Show because he digs in and he approaches things from a rational viewpoint. A couple of episodes I've really enjoyed, an interview with Sammy the Bull Gravano, which many of you have heard of, and who was a mafia underboss for the Gambino crime family. And one I know you'll enjoy if you listen to our JonBenét Ramsey episodes and decided you were a psychopath is Do the Math. Am I a psychopath? So check that one out if you got our riddle right.
Jordan's always focused on pulling useful, practical insights out of his brilliant guests, and we're not talking about pop psychology or wishy-washy self-help stuff here. The episodes are loaded with bits of wisdom that you can use to legitimately change your mind and improve your life right away. We really enjoy this show, and we think you will as well. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show. That's HARB as in boy, IN as in Nancy, GER on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Okay, so putting the scream aside, let's talk about, I don't want to say it's the elephant in the room, but it is one of the most debated things about this case, and that's whether or not it is possible for someone to have come through that open window. There has been eternal debate about whether the window grate, which had a spider web in it, showed any indication of an intruder. So we've talked about the federal court opinion before, the Carnes opinion. According to that opinion, the filings of Burke Ramsey and his lawsuit against CBS and Lou Smith, there were the following signs of an intruder. I'm going to read to you from the Carnes opinion. Leaves and white styrofoam packing peanuts that had pooled in the window area appeared to have been cleared from or brushed to either side of the window sill. A shard of glass was found on the suitcase beneath the window. Green foliage was found tucked under the movable grate over the window well. Leaves and debris consistent with that found in the window area were found on the floor of the basement underneath the window. A leaf and white styrofoam packing peanuts like those in the window area were found in the wine cellar where JonBenét's body was found. Those are some pretty powerful things. If you've seen pictures of the window well, and you can see these on our website because I pulled one that had this, you can see where these styrofoam peanuts are brushed aside. I don't know why there were styrofoam peanuts in the window well. I don't know how they got there, but when you look at it, you can see they've been pushed to the right side. And the question is that an indication of someone coming through? Then you have the leaf, things like that, the foliage being under the grate. Compare this, by the way, to the Darlie Routier case, where you had a supposed entry point for an intruder, but there was no indication whatsoever that anyone had come through. Not even this much of an indication. None. And people had done tests to show, well, you could come through without leaving anything, and you can take that for what it's worth, but it is certainly the case that there was no indication anyone had gone through that window. In this case, there are at least some things. Now, there are people who will say that this is all irrelevant. Maybe this is from when John came through the window a couple months before. Remember, the reason the window is broken is because John has used it to enter his home before when he locked himself out, which is apparently something he did quite often.
Brett, one thing that really has stuck out to me, though, remember, this is December, the end of December, so heart of winter in Colorado, and it's cold, and this is an area of the house that's not usually traversed well, probably because it's the basement, but it was visited pretty often in the days prior to JonBenét's murder because they stored presents in the room where she was found. So they went past this window multiple times. And when there's an open door or window in my house in the winter, I certainly feel the draft and I go look for it because it's expensive for my heating bill, it's drafty, and I just noticed that, there's an entry point into my house and I'd rather it be closed rather than open. And so it would kind of surprise me that no one would have noticed this window being open and ajar on these cold days in the winter in Colorado.
It's interesting you bring that up because there's also debate about whether the window was open that night. Different people say at different times that it was open or closed. You may recall Fleet White did not remember whether it was open. John said it was open. Pictures by the police show it open, but it's a little unclear about whether it was open the whole time or not. And I don't know. It's an interesting question, and you have to remember people focus on this a lot as the entry point for whoever this was, but don't forget all of those keys that were available. It's possible this is a complete red herring, that John had gone in through this window before, but the window isn't really even relevant, that it's not an entry point and it's not an exit point. It just is. Now, the foliage is interesting. And there's, in one of the Boulder Police Department reports, they talk about, and I'll quote from it, "The weight of the grate crushed and traumatized the plant material under it. The plant will not just grow under the grate naturally," which is an indication that the person who wrote this report, when they looked at the grate and they looked at the plant, what they saw was a plant that the grate had been pushed over on top of it, and recently. And that was an indication to them that this was a possible entry point. I mean, you hear people say that there's no evidence that the window was used as an entry point. And that's just not true. I mean, there is evidence. It's not conclusive, and it doesn't definitively tell you that this was an intruder, or maybe it was John before. It's a little unclear. And then there is the spider web. Now, if you've seen the CBS documentary, they do a little experiment with the spider web, and like every other experiment they do, it's completely faulty. They make the spider web much larger than it actually was in real life. You can see pictures of it. We put them on the website. One thing, people who defend the Ramseys will say that the spider web is irrelevant because the spider could have made the web after this person came in or out. If you look at this spider web, it's very clearly old. This spider web has been there a while. This is not a spider web that was made by some industrious winter Christmas spider the night that JonBenét Ramsey was killed. It also has these packing peanuts sort of in it. So it feels like it's been there a while, and if anybody came through, they did so without brushing against this spider web. To me, I don't see how that's impossible. I mean, it looks to me like you could go in that window without touching the spider web. And I don't like spiders, so if I was doing it, I would probably try and avoid the spider web. Now, I get it. If there were no spider web, that would be better evidence of an intruder. Or if the spider web were completely destroyed, that would show an intruder went through it. That is not there. So you can point to that as evidence that there was no intruder. But I don't think it's an impossibility to go through that grate without disturbing the spider web. But that assumes there is no disturbance of the spider web, and that's not even clear. It is not clear that this spider web showed no signs of disturbance. There are conflicting reports about that, which blows my mind, because you would think, given how critical this detail is, that the police would have been able to definitively say either that spider web is intact or it's not intact. And they can't do that. All we have are the pictures that we have, and all we can do is take those at face value. In addition to this, the Boulder Police Department also reported finding pry marks in 2 or 3 distinct areas on what they called the solarium door, which I think is like a sliding door. But they didn't find any wood chips near this, so they assumed this was old damage and sort of discarded that as a possible point of entry.
Maybe the best evidence for an intruder might be what is not found. JonBenét was choked to death with a nylon cord. The remainder of that cord was never found. Her mouth was covered with duct tape. The rest of the duct tape was never found. There were pages missing from the notepad containing the ransom note, and most investigators believe those were removed by the killer. Thomas theorized that Patsy slipped out of the house and disposed of those pieces of evidence in a storm drain or nearby trash can. Again, there's a glaring inconsistency in the crime scene that makes you question that scenario. First, if Patsy were disposing of evidence, why not throw away the notepad and pen too? Why leave them for the police to find and figure out that the paper from the ransom note actually came from a notepad in the house? Moreover, if the flashlight was the weapon used to strike JonBenét, why not dispose of the murder weapon? Why leave it on the kitchen table for everyone to see? But on the other hand, if you aren't going to dispose of things that clearly link the crime to the home, the notepad and the pen, then why dispose of the duct tape and the cord? If the killer is using items from the home and you're fine with that being obvious, why dispose of anything at all? Just leave it all there. And, this person came in and used the things they found in the home to commit this horrendous crime. But perhaps most strikingly, why not stage a break-in a la Darlie Routier? Why not make it more obvious that maybe everything had been disturbed and the window grate had been even more disturbed, and it was clear that someone had broken in through the window if you were the Ramseys trying to cover up the crime? Instead, we're like grasping at straws trying to see if there was an intruder.
Yeah, just leave a door open. Go to that sliding glass door and just slide it open and be like, oh, I forgot to lock it. You got to remember, one of the first things John tells the police is he thought every door was locked and every key was accounted for, which is not true. We realized there were plenty of keys that weren't accounted for, but if John is part of this cover-up, then why in the world would he say that? He should be like, yeah, there's keys all over the place. Could have been anybody. Could have been any of these doors. But he's like adamant, like, no, there's no way they could have got in. And then, later on realizes that this window is broken and open. To me, that one of the biggest things about it is this is a very poorly staged break-in if you're trying to stage a break-in. And when you think about everything else that had to be staged, this goes back to what I was just saying about this contradictory evidence, right? Like if the parents did it and staged this horrible murder and did all the things they had to do to stage it, we're going to talk about that more later on. They did all that to her body, but they didn't bother to leave a door open. I mean, to me, that's crazy. They did all that to her body. They went outside and got rid of all this evidence, but they left all this other evidence. They left the pineapple on the table. They left the notepad, and they left the flashlight. They didn't make the entrance more obvious. I mean, to me, that's just very strange. It just doesn't really fit. And the fact of this missing evidence to me is pretty interesting. And it's hard. I mean, maybe they did throw it down a storm drain, right? I mean, that's certainly possible. We come back to Darlie Routier a lot in this case just because there are some striking similarities, and one of them would be if the parents did this, is much like Darlie Routier. They went out into the night that night to get rid of some evidence, or to plant some evidence in her case with the sock, in their case to get rid of some stuff. And that's a dangerous thing to do, but it's desperate times call for desperate actions. It's just weird that they didn't do any of the things you would expect. Maybe they forgot. I mean, staging a crime is a difficult thing, but you have to believe they thought of so many things. Like we said before, if you think the fact that the batteries don't have any fingerprints on them points to the guilt of the parents, then you have to believe that the parents took the batteries out and wiped them down to get rid of fingerprints because they thought about that much, to that fine a detail about how they were going to stage this, that they wiped the fingerprints off the battery. But they didn't just get rid of the flashlight when they got rid of the cord. I mean, to me, those things are so inconsistent that it's hard for me to believe that is part of one coherent theory about what happened in the case. So yeah, I mean, that's not a lot of evidence of an intruder. There's some there, but not a ton. One thing I'll say about this crime, that this is not, I mean, this is a violent crime, but it's not a violent crime in the way that, say, the Darlie Routier case was a violent crime. There's not a lot of struggle going on here. This would have been an adult taking a child and doing horrible things to them, but, you know, you're not expecting, like in Jeffrey McDonald. Jeffrey McDonald says a whole group of people came in, beat him up, and killed his family, and yet there's no indication of a fight in the living room, right? I mean, that's completely strange. It doesn't make any sense. And in this case, you really wouldn't expect to see that much stuff. The kinds of things you would expect to see would be the evidence of the entry, of the exit, maybe some stuff in the room with JonBenét. One thing people have pointed to as a reason to think it might have been the parents, there was a blanket found in that room, in the wine cellar, and as we've said before, oftentimes when parents are responsible for the murder of a child, you'll find them with their favorite toy wrapped in their favorite blanket. And so a lot of people have pointed to this. And a lot of people have asked John Douglas why he doesn't think this is more significant, because he has often said he doesn't believe the parents were involved. And as an FBI profiler, and really one of the fathers of profiling, he's one of the people who said, when you find a blanket, look to the parents. One thing he points out is the blanket was there, but it wasn't one of those things where she was wrapped tightly in it. It was just kind of covering her. And so to him, he thinks this is probably just more a random thing that whenever whoever this was got her out of the bedroom, the blanket sort of came with her, then it's an indication of the parents. I don't know which way I go on that. I mean, I think the fact she's got that blanket is significant. I don't think it's enough to say, yeah, I think the parents did it, but it's an interesting piece of evidence, and it kind of makes you wonder if that is something, one of the few pieces of strong evidence that might point to the parents' involvement.
Okay, so did Santa Claus do it? JonBenét Ramsey made a statement in the days leading up to her death, and this is an excerpt from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Quote, Barbara Kostanek was the mother of a playmate of JonBenét Ramsey's. She asserted, the day before Christmas, JonBenét was at our house playing with Megan. The kids were talking about Santa, getting all excited. I asked JonBenét if she had visited Santa Claus yet. She said, oh, Santa was at our Christmas party the other night. Megan had seen Santa at the Pearl Street Mall, so we talked about that. Then JonBenét said, Santa Claus promised that he would make a secret visit after Christmas. I thought she was confused. Christmas is tonight, I told her, and Santa will be coming tonight. No, JonBenét insisted. He said this would be after Christmas, and it's a secret.
So when we talked about the timeline in that very first episode, we said that we would come back to this, that this was something we talk about more, and here we are. A couple things to note about this. If this is an accurate statement, and look, this is a witness testimony after this happened. It's not like she had a tape recorder. She probably didn't think much of it when JonBenét said it the first time. So taking each of these words as gospel is probably a little much, but let's do that for a second. Let's just assume for a second that what she is saying is what JonBenét said. A couple things. People who dismiss this say, oh, you know, she's just talking about Santa Claus coming. That is not what she's talking about. Or she's just talking about Santa Claus at the party. That is not what she's talking about. Or she's talking about Santa Claus coming to Charlevoix when they go to Michigan. He's going to have another visit from Santa Claus. That doesn't seem like what she's talking about either. I think that's a really good guess if these are not JonBenét's exact words. Just Santa Claus is going to come visit me after Christmas. If that's what she said, I think the Charlevoix thing makes a lot of sense because they were going to have Christmas up there. And so it's like she's having all these Christmases and Santa's everywhere, right? But that's not what she says, at least in this. She says, no, he said this would be after Christmas and it's a secret. So a couple things about that. Number one, it's secret. This is a secret visit. And Santa Claus told her this. Not she was anticipating it when she went to Charlevoix, but that Santa Claus said to her, I am going to come see you after Christmas, and it's a secret visit. I mean, I don't know. It's so creepy. That is just so creepy that it sends chills down my spine to think about that, because this could be it. Now, we don't know that it's it. Could be completely innocuous, but this would explain so much, because one of the big questions has been, how did this person get JonBenét out of her room without anyone knowing? And this is what led to Lou Smith's theory that it was a stun gun, which a lot of people have said is not true. Well, imagine if whoever told her this is the killer, and they show up that night, and they walk into that room, and JonBenét thinks it's Santa Claus. And this person, is like, shh, don't say anything. It's a secret. We wouldn't want Burke to know, or whatever, right? She would go with them willingly, quietly. She would leave that room. She would go downstairs and, maybe he makes her some pineapple. Who knows, right? I mean, it would answer so many questions if this Santa Claus thing were more than just a red herring.
Yes, I agree with you. Those words are haunting and chilling. And let's say that these were the words that she actually said that day to Barbara. The elephant in the room is we have an unbelievably unreliable narrator in a 6-year-old, right? And I don't say this lightly. I say this because we see this in our cases. People are generally unreliable in how specific they are with their words, and especially with children. I'll give a small example. My child is 4, and yesterday he had this like red mark on his leg during bath time, and he was complaining. He said, this really hurts. And I said, it looked like someone had hit him. And I said, how did you get that mark? And he told this long, intense story about this kid in his class. And when they were at recess, he took this like specific toy. He described the toy car down to the color of the rims of this monster truck and the way he threw it. And he listed the number of people in his class who saw what happened, and that he was sent away from this room and had to go sit in a different room. And this kid's mom, who teaches at the school, was called in, and they had a big talking to. And I mean, it was a long story. And I was like, oh my gosh, this really happened. And I was starting to doubt it a little bit. And then at the very end, he said something. Everything sounded realistic to me until he said, and then his mama took him home and spanked him. And I said, how do you know that? And he said, because I went home with them and I watched her spank him. And I was like, obviously that did not happen. My child did not go home with anyone yesterday. And I was like, okay, are you sure? I was like, is this just a story, or did this really happen? He kept insisting it really happened. And it was a serious enough of a story that if what he said happened, I needed to talk to the teacher, right? And I had gotten no word from the school. And so this morning, before I kind of raged into my child's classroom and demanded to talk to the teacher, I asked him one more time. I said, that story you told me yesterday about your classmate, did it happen, or was it just a story? And he said, it really happened. And I said, I'm not going to be mad if it's a story, but before I go talk to your teacher, I'd really like to know if this is just pretend or if it's for real. And he kept insisting it's real. And then we were driving to school, and I said, okay, I'm going to go talk to the teacher about this classmate. And he said, oh, Mama, it was just a story. Truly, it was in incredible detail. And the mannerisms that he was emanating from his teacher, from this classmate, were all what they would say, right? Their manner of saying things, it was all spot on. And it was such an intense story that I didn't really think it happened, but if it did, I was like, I should probably file some charges. And I say that because even if these are JonBenét's words, and Barbara is a perfect transmitter of JonBenét's words, it's possible that a 6-year-old may have confused timing after Christmas and secret. And I say this because we visited a Santa, and as we were leaving, the Santa said, I'm coming to your house. And like for days after, my son kept saying, he's coming to my house. He's coming to my house. And he kept saying, even after Christmas, he's coming to my house, because he had heard it. And I said, well, it was for Christmas. It's over. He goes, no. He told me he's coming to my house. And so I can imagine that a 6-year-old may kind of mix up these things, and everything around Santa's a secret, right? Oh, you better be good. He's watching. Be quiet. Be good. And everything about Christmas is magical. And secretive. So I just say that because if these are her words, a 6-year-old is an unreliable narrator.
And look, I think it is likely the case that this is a red herring. I think that's the most likely thing. I mean, it could be a huge thing. If I were the police, I would definitely look into any possible Santa Clauses that came into contact with JonBenét, but I think this is probably a red herring. Now, having said that, there is a Santa Claus that had a close relationship with JonBenét, and that's a man named Bill McReynolds, Santa Bill McReynolds. He played Santa at the Ramsey's Christmas party, and he and JonBenét were very close, either in a very sweet, innocent way or a very sinister way, depending on what you think happened. JonBenét had given him vials of glitter that she called stardust as a gift, and he had actually taken these vials of glitter with him to the hospital when he had open heart surgery. He later said that when he died, he wanted his ashes mixed with the glitter she'd given him. This is what he said: "I felt very close to that little girl. I don't really have other children that I have this special relationship with, not even my own children or my own grandchildren. When I die, I'm going to be cremated. I've asked my wife to mix the stardust JonBenét gave me with my ashes. We're going to go up behind the cabin here and have it blow away in the wind." I mean, that's intense. But once again, I don't know. I mean, maybe that's perfectly innocent, or maybe it's a sign of something deeper. Now, he had open heart surgery, and this is something people point to a lot because people question whether or not, even if he did have ill intent, that he would have been capable of pulling it off, given his state. The open heart surgery had been relatively recent. Now, according to CNN, Trip DeMuth, who was a prosecutor working on the case, reported that 2 days before the murder of JonBenét, McReynolds had given her a note that was later discovered in her trash can. It was said to read, "You will receive a special gift after Christmas," which seems to go along with what JonBenét said earlier. But there are a couple things that are problems with this. Number one, I don't know that anyone has ever been able to confirm the existence of this note. If you can confirm it, I'd love to hear it. DeMuth was considered an unreliable person by some people in the investigation, in particular Scott Thomas, who despises him. If you've read his book, half the book is about how much Trip DeMuth sucked. And it's possible that DeMuth is just conflating this statement that JonBenét said, and there really wasn't this note. I don't know. You know, this Santa Claus thing is one of those things you can spend a lot of time on.
We've never seen evidence that this note existed, right?
I can't find any confirmation of the existence of this note. No. All I know is CNN reported on it.
That's so creepy. When was the open heart surgery?
I think it was only a couple months before she was killed.
Okay, so she was still alive when he said that. She was alive.
Oh, the stuff about the
mixing his ashes with.
No, she was dead.
Oh, okay.
When he said that. She gave him the glitter, which he took.
I got it.
To his open heart surgery. Yeah.
Okay, wait. So when was the heart surgery? Was it many years after, or was it close in time to her death?
No, I think it was like 3 months before she died. So she gave the glitter to him for him to take.
Oh,
to the surgery.
I got it.
Yeah. And so he took that with him as like a good luck charm, right? But then when she died, he was like, I am going to mix this with my.
Did he have children?
Yeah, he had children and grandchildren.
That's weird.
Yeah. I mean, he says that he's closer to her than his children or grandchildren.
I can imagine if you had no children and this was like your tie to, another generation and you felt like a father figure. But if you have your own children, I find this a little bit strange. How did Bill know the Ramseys?
I mean, he played Santa Claus at like 3 of their parties. I know that.
But how do they know each other?
He was a Colorado journalism professor. I don't know how they actually knew each other. Now, they considered him a suspect. The Ramseys were definitely suspicious of him after all this happened.
Yeah, again, this is with her comment and the fact that he played Santa, and if the note existed that you'll get a present after Christmas, that could, strongly put him in the suspect category, but there's so much that we just don't know. Like, I don't know if that note exists. I think that's a huge question. Just the fact that he played Santa itself, a lot of people are Santa figures at Christmas time, and it could have been him she was talking about. It could have been a mall Santa, any number of Santas that she could have seen. We saw dozens of Santa over the Christmas season. So this all feels very creepy, and I see why he would be a popular suspect. But that's what's so frustrating about this case, Brett. There are so many strange aspects and things that you can latch onto and say, of course, this is who killed her, but there's just so little evidence to back up your, what I call the heebie-jeebies.
No, I mean, this is very much a shot in the dark. I mean, there's no real evidence against Bill McReynolds. And he was investigated by the police somewhat thoroughly. As we'll talk about later, Scott Thomas had a... Scott Thomas or Steve Thomas?
Just say Thomas.
Thomas has this bad habit of basically dismissing any suspect that's not the Ramseys. And he did that a little bit with McReynolds, but he was looked into. The DA definitely suspected him. There was a lot of investigating of him. I feel like he was pretty well cleared of this crime, but he is a popular suspect. So that's sort of the evidence for an intruder to the extent it exists. We're going to wrap it up for this week. Next week, we're going to talk more about some of the personalities in this case, the detectives, what they thought. We'll talk about Lou Smith. We'll talk about Steve Thomas and how they disagreed and how they really represent sort of polar opposite views in this case. We will talk about the grand jury in this case, which I know is something that you all are very interested in and is a fascinating thing that happened in this case. It was only recently uncovered. We'll talk about what it means, if it means anything. And we'll also talk about the fact that at some point the Boulder DA cleared the Ramseys and said they have nothing to do with this case. We'll talk about why they did that and whether or not that was a good decision. And then finally, we will talk about our theories of this case, the theories that are out there, and which ones we think are most likely. And we'll share with you our view on what happened. You guys have been great about giving us feedback. We want to continue to hear it. I hope you're still enjoying our presentation of this case now that we are, 7 episodes into it. So shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod for all your social media. Hit us up on Instagram, Reddit, YouTube. Join us on the gallery on Facebook. There's been a lot of great discussion of this case on there. If you hate the ads, join Patreon. If you want to support our sponsors, do that. They keep us going, and we love it when you guys support them. Well, Alice, is there anything else you want to say before we wrap it up for this week?
No, but I'm really enjoying this very deep dive with all of you. We really do read all of your comments and your emails. It's been very civil so far, and also, you guys have very strong opinions, so we're definitely going to let some of you down at the end.
Oh yeah, everybody's got strong opinions. It's interesting to read you guys and your opinions and how you think this went down and the various theories that people have accounting for the various evidence. I mean, it's really fascinating because people have, like, I've read theories where Patsy wrote the note but had nothing else to do with the crime, and that the Ramseys are absolutely innocent of the crime, but for some reason wrote the note. And they give the reason why, not just for some reason. Or that it was all Burke. Burke wrote the note, and Burke strangled JonBenét and took her body downstairs, even though he's 9 years old. And it's a little difficult to imagine how he would do that, but the parents had nothing to do with it and don't even know it. And then the theories that it's an intruder, and the theories that, it's John or it's Patsy, and why it is, and what people think the note means. I mean, it's really fascinating to read you guys' opinions. So I'm glad you guys are sharing them. I just want you to know, even though we can't respond to all of them. I mean, there's been so many so many comments and emails and posts about this case, and we've read them all, even if we haven't responded to them. So thank you guys for that. I hope you'll stay engaged, and we will see you next week. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Okay, you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. You seem so excited.
I haven't talked to you in so long. I just missed you. That's all.
No, I miss you too. You talk to me every day, but that's okay.
But not like about not work.
True.
Not work is better than
Not work.
talking about work. So that's all.
That's a good point.
Just wanted you to know that I care about you. Scott Thomas's book. It is Scott Thomas, right? People keep saying both on the chat.
No, maybe it's Steve Thomas.
Just say Thomas. Thomas's book.
This February on Pluto TV, we're putting the spotlight on iconic Black talent. Watch your favorite movies like Top 5, 48 Hours, and More Than a Game. And drop in to binge Black TV classics like The Bernie Mac Show and Moesha. Pluto TV has hundreds of channels and thousands more movies and TV shows, all for free. So download the Pluto TV app on your favorite streaming device and start watching today. Pluto TV, drop in, watch free.